Hey guys, how are you all doing? This is the MMA Breakdown with my predictions for UFC Fight Night 44, Swanson versus Stevens. And I really have no problem with the main event of this card. I think this is one of the better free Fight Night cards we've gotten in a while. I've become a big fan of Cub Swanson over this last win streak he's put together, and I think the winner of this fight should definitely deserve and should be fighting for the title immediately after this fight. But there are some other really good guys on this card, Kevin Gastelum, and then the Miles Jury Abel Trujillo fight that was supposed to be on this card. I thought that was a tremendous fight, really important fight and really interesting, and it was too bad that fell through. But I think this is a stronger effort than a lot of the other Fight Night cards, both on Fight Pass and Fox Sports 1, that we've gotten this summer. And definitely way better than the New Zealand card that's happening the same day just before this one. But let's run through the card. I'll give you my predictions on all the fights. I'm going to have to skip this first fight, the only Fight Pass prelim card, a heavyweight fight between Alexei Olenek and Anthony Hamilton. Don't know either of those guys, so I have to skip that. And on the Fox Sports 1 preliminary card at flyweight, Ray Borg versus Shane Howell. Shane Howell, a newcomer that I don't know anything about, but Ray Borg, he's coming off of his debut fight with Dustin Ortiz, and I thought that was a really close competitive fight. A lot of fans probably haven't seen it because it was a Fight Pass prelim, but he really impressed me. I thought it was a razor-thin decision for Ortiz. He was able to get on top a little more than stay on top of Borg, but Borg had several moments where he took the back extremely quickly. He didn't have to... He threw the hooks in and got the over-under control just real fast. It reminded me of how... Hayden Barrow took Brad Pickett's back. He did that several times throughout the fight, and he just seemed like a really tough, scrappy grappler. So he's a guy I'm excited to see again, and expect him to do well here. If you haven't seen him fight before, Ray Borg, I think, is a guy to keep an eye on. But again, don't know anything about Shane Howell, but I will take Ray Borg. Next up at middleweight, Marcelo Guimaraes taking on Andy Enns. Andy Enns is the guy that Uriah Hall beat in the preliminary fights to get into the house on Tough 17, and actually took Hall to a decision, I believe, in that fight. And then he's coming off of his debut loss to Clint Hester, where he was outstruck but did stay in there the whole time. That was really the only thing I was impressed with in his debut, was that he didn't get finished. And Marcelo Guimaraes, he's had 2 fights in the UFC, I believe. His first one was a very kind of unimpressive win over Dan Stitchin. I remember at the end of the third round, he had him in the clinch pressed up against the fence, and he was throwing these very ineffective and meaningless shots to the body, and he was just screaming with a bunch of passion, and it was entertaining, but not a very effective fighter. And then he got knocked out cold by Hyun-Gyu Lim in his last fight. So I'm going to take Andy Enns here. I think he's a more active striker, and Guimaraes just seems like a really low-level guy, a low-level UFC fighter to me. So I think Andy Enns is gonna pull out a decision. Next up at bantamweight, Johnny Bedford taking on Cody Gibson. I've really been impressed with Bedford. He's had a few nice wins in the UFC. He's a vet of Tough 14. I believe he got knocked out by John Dodson on the show. But since coming into the UFC, he finished Louis Gaudino and Marcus Vinicius. Finished both those guys. He's a very aggressive striker. He goes after it on the feet right from the opening round. Did get submitted by Caraway in his last fight. And then he had that real crazy headbutt no contest against Hani Yahya. And I thought he just acted like a dick after that fight. He was mad at Yahya and he thought he should have gotten the victory there for knocking the guy out with a headbutt. But he's a real aggressive striker. I think we saw against Caraway he's going to struggle with the more technical guys who aren't those low level fighters like Gaudino and Vinicius. But Cody Gibson, I didn't see enough in his debut. Lost to Aljamain Sterling, where I thought Sterling looked great, and I thought he really dominated Gibson. And I thought Gibson looked, tough. He did well to not get finished in that fight, but that was really it. And I think Bedford's just going to eat him up on the feet. I think Bedford's way too aggressive, and I think he can get a finish here. So I'm taking Bedford by TKO. And next up, the last fight on the Fox Sports 1 preliminary card. Colton Smith taking on Carlos Diego Ferreira. Another newcomer, Carlos Diego Ferreira, that I don't know. But Colton Smith, I'm interested to see him again. I think he's an underrated fighter. A lot of people very critical of him when he beat Mike Ricci. Basically, he just laid and prayed Mike Ricci. He is a strong wrestler. He has effective grappling. He's able to hold guys down. And he's not a terrible striker for a guy who mainly wrestles. He did take Whitaker to the third round before getting knocked out in that fight. And he did manage to drop Whitaker in that fight as well. And against Chiesa, he took his back real early on and almost choked out Chiesa, which I thought was very impressive before getting choked out there. So kind of struggling to win fights in his last few. And again, I don't know anything about Diego Ferreira, so I'm just kind of commenting on what I think of Colton Smith. I think he's a pretty strong wrestler and grappler. When he's able to implement that, and on the feet, I don't think he's too bad. I'm going to take him, but that's really just a guess. I don't know anything about Ferreira, and I don't think that I don't regard him as a really promising guy. I think we've kind of seen the best out of him, but if Ferreira is a typical newcomer who's a low-level MMA fighter, I'd feel comfortable taking Colton Smith, but don't really know there. But I will take Colton Smith. Just guessing there. And on to the main card, lightweight Joe Ellenberger taking on James Muntazeri. Again, two newcomers. Gonna have to skip this fight. I'll just say I hope Ellenberger wins, brother of Jake Ellenberger. He has a really emotional story, struggling with his illness for most of his life, I think. But hoping he can get the victory. Can't make a pick there. I'll completely skip that one. Next up at middleweight, Clint Hester taking on Antonio Braga Neto. Braga Neto is coming off of his debut win over Anthony Smith, where he got the knee bar. And Clint Hester, his weakness has been the ground game. He's a vet of Tough 17, and in the house he was smashing Jimmy Quinlan, doing very well on the feet, looked great. he was able to fend off the takedown for most of the fight, and even when Quinlan was in on his legs against the fence, he was throwing brutal elbows to the body. When he's on, his striking looks really special, but his weakness has been the ground game. Dylan Andrews also is able to take down Hester a few times before dislocating his shoulder. So I would watch out for that. I think there's a pretty good chance that Neto will be able to wrap up a leg or somehow get it to the ground, or if it ends up on the ground, I think there's a good chance he could submit Hester. Hester, though, again, very athletic guy, and striking looks really good. After Tough, he had a knockout of Bristol Marunde, where he got him with an elbow. He had that doctor stoppage win over Andrews, who dislocated his shoulder. We didn't get to see much there. And then his last win over Andy Enns, a lot of people were really critical of him for not being able to finish that fight. Came out really strong in the first round and kind of faded as the fight went on. Wasn't able to keep up the horsepower, but still won every round in that fight with his striking. I kind of want to take Hester. Just because I really like his striking style, and I want to see him do well, but I think Neto might pull out a submission here, unless Hester has made some big improvements in his ground game and submission defense. And that, again, in that fight with Quinlan, he was really beating him up, stuffed a bunch of his takedowns, and then I can't remember if it was the first or second round, but it was in the second round, and Quinlan was able to I think it was off of the only takedown he landed in the fight, just took him down and was able to get that rear naked choke and choke him out. So I'm going to take Neto, but I definitely think Hester has a chance. He could win the fight. Just depends on how much he's improved his ground game. Next up at featherweight, Ricardo Lamas taking on Hakran Diaz. This is a really intriguing fight, and one of the fights that really bolsters this whole card for me. Lamas needs to get back on the winning track. He's kind of become a forgotten man, I think, after his loss to Aldo, where I thought that was a pretty disappointing performance by Lamas. He never really committed to doing anything big. He just seemed kind of stuck, and nothing was really working for him in that fight. He did manage to get on top of Aldo in the last round, in the fifth round, but really had nothing for Aldo that whole fight. And before his fight with Aldo, he had some great wins. A stoppage over Eric Koch. As soon as they touched the ground, he just ground and pounded him into oblivion. Smashed up Koch's face. He looked good there. I did think he got robbed. I thought Hioki got robbed against Lamas. He spent a lot of time on his back in that fight, which makes me think that Diaz has a chance to out-wrestle him, because Diaz is a really good grappler, but he also had a win over Cub Swanson, the only guy to beat him in a long time. So Lamas, he has good striking skills. He's got power in his hands, and obviously his ground and pound is really good. He has wrestling and submission ability. We saw that against Cub Swanson. And I will pick him to win this fight. But Hakran Diaz, I think a lot of people don't know who this guy is, but don't sleep on this guy. He's only had, I think, 2 fights in the UFC, but in his debut he took on Yuri Alcantara when Alcantara was on a win streak. And Alcantara is a very good grappler, really good jiu-jitsu guy. and Diaz just dominated him with the wrestling. Wasn't a very exciting fight, but I thought he was very impressive. Out wrestled Alcantara, and then in his fight with Nick Lentz, Lentz was kind of able to take him down at will. And if I remember correctly, I think in that third round, Hakran Diaz turned it around for a bit. I think he was getting to Lentz on the feet, which seems to be a common theme for Lentz. He gets in trouble on the feet in that third round after wrestling guys for the first two, but he lost that fight against Nick Lentz, seemed to get outworked. I was kind of surprised. So I do think Lamas, is good enough. He's faced better competition. And this is a fight he needs to look good in. But again, I have some hope for Diaz. I was really impressed with the win over Alcantara. But Lamas should be favored here, and I think he should get the win. And I'm going to predict by ground and pound. And next up, Cesar Mutanche Ferreira taking on Andrew Craig. Cesar Mutanche Ferreira, really surprising knockout loss, I thought, for him in his last fight against Dalloway. This is a guy I've been really high on since he won Tough Brazil 1. He beat Sergio Moraes in the finale. And I think in hindsight, that's where some of his problems may have started. In that fight, Moraes, a jiu-jitsu guy, really, that's his whole game is jiu-jitsu. He was able to crack Ferreira, I believe it was in the second or third round, when Ferreira's he's the striker, he's the Muay Thai guy. I think he's also a capoeira fighter. And Moraes was able to crack him, and I remember Joe Rogan making a big deal about that during that fight. And also, he wasn't able to put him away, even though he was pretty much dominating him on the feet, before he got cracked. He looked real good in his win over Thiago Santos. After that, choked him out with a rolling guillotine choke. He got the guillotine and was able to roll over backwards, end up on top. I thought that was really impressive. And then his fight with Daniel Sarafian, he really surprisingly got outboxed on the feet. Sarafian gave him a big black eye, I remember, in that fight, and Ferreira really had to revert to his wrestling there to take down Sarafian, and being the bigger guy, he had to hold him down, being the bigger guy. And then after that, Dalloway was able to knock him out. And in the house, he had some real good finishes over guys who haven't done too well in the UFC. I remember one of the guys, I think, was Thiago Perpetuo. I can't remember the other guy. But he has a real good guillotine choke, and he's a very lethal striker. I believe he put someone down with a head kick in the house too. But Andrew Craig, I don't think is going to be skilled enough on the feet to hang with Ferreira, although Ferreira, I think his chin is suspect now. Thinking about the Moraes fight where he got cracked and then getting knocked out cold by Dalloway, who, shouldn't have. I really didn't think Dalloway would be able to compete with Ferreira on the feet. I don't think his striking game is. He might have more power, but it's not nearly as technical, polished as Ferreira's with the capoeira and Muay Thai background that Ferreira has. Andrew Craig had his last fight against Luke Barnett. He started out looking really good. Was able to out-jab Barnett. Used good head movement to avoid Barnett's striking, but eventually got knocked down and submitted. Had a tough win over Lieben that I actually thought was kind of a close fight, and I remember scoring that fight for Lieben. I think he did knock down Lieben, but hasn't been terribly impressive in his UFC career. He was also badly out-wrestled by Hani Marks. Did have a head kick KO over Rafael Natal, but before that he was really getting dominated on the feet by Natal. So, and then in his debut had a win over Kyle Noak. So I'm not terribly high on Andrew Craig. I think he's just kind of a tough guy with average wrestling, average striking, and I think Ferreira just has too many tools. I think his stand-up is way more lethal and diverse, and even on the ground, I think he might be able to submit Craig. But I'm taking Ferreira here, although I do think Ferreira might have some mental lapses. The way he's kind of standing in front of Dalloway leading up to the knockout didn't really look good. But I'm going to take Ferreira, and I still have some hope for him. Even though he got knocked out in his last fight, I still think he's a really talented guy. Next up, the co-main event at welterweight, Kelvin Gastelum taking on Nicholas Musoke, a Swedish fighter, I believe. And I really wish Gastelum would get a better opponent here, or at least someone who's more exciting. Nicholas Musoke, he's had 2 fights in the UFC, won both of them. In his debut, submitted Alessio Sakara by armbar. After getting cracked early on, he was able to take Alessio Sakara down, or I can't remember if he took him down or if it was Sakara who took him down, but they ended up on the ground, and Musoke was able to get the armbar real quickly. And then his last fight against Viscardi Andrade, again he got dropped real badly in the first round, looked like he was out, but that was about all the success that Andrade had in that fight. Musoke really outclassed him on the ground, had way more technical grappling game, and was just able to outposition Andrade for the rest of that fight. I don't think he has any chance of doing that to Gastelum. Gastelum, really high on this guy. His run through the Tough House I thought was very impressive. He finished I think he finished everyone except Uriah Hall in the finale and the guy he beat in the fight to get into the house. But he had a tough fight with Bubba McDaniel where he was put in some bad positions on the ground but ended up submitting him. He showed real great power and hand speed against Colin Hart, knocked him out quickly, and then submitted Josh Saman, who a lot of people were really high on to win that show. And then the UFC, of course, had the win over Uriah Hall. Looked great against Brian Melanson. I thought he showed real good hand speed again, and he's got real powerful boxing. He hurt Melanson on the feet, dropped him, and immediately took the back and submitted him with the rear naked choke. And then in his last fight, stepped way up in the rankings, took on Rick Story, and I actually thought Rick Story kind of got robbed in that fight, but it was a back and forth fight. I believe Gastelum knocked him down with a head kick. I think it was in the second round. Came close to finishing him at one point. It was a tough fight, though. And again, I think Story should have won that fight. And I think the UFC kind of realized, while he did, it was very impressive to even make that fight as competitive as it was against Story. I don't think Gastelum's quite ready for those top 15 guys, but he is very talented, a really young guy, and I think he's just gonna walk over Musoke. I really do. Again, Musoke's been dropped in his last 2 fights. I think Gastelum has way better boxing and bigger power than either of those guys who dropped Musoke. And he's got the wrestling too. I don't think Musoke is going to be able to use his crafty technical grappling against Gastelum. The only thing I think Gastelum might have a problem with is the weight cut. I think that kind of affected him in the last fight. Seemed to gas a bit. But I think Gastelum's going to finish Musoke in the first round here. And then the main event, Cub Swanson versus Jeremy Lil Heathen Stevens, featherweight fight. Again, like I said, I think this is a great main event. And Cub Swanson's been on a real tear. And I am taking Swanson to win this fight. I think he'll win a decision. Jeremy Stevens, well, he's looked very good since coming down to featherweight. You really can't compare his run to Cub Swanson's. I mean, he's on a 3-fight win streak. And by the way, he was on a 3-fight losing streak at lightweight before dropping down to featherweight, which, is kind of irrelevant. But, the guys he beat, Esteban Payan in his debut, who he couldn't put away, even though he dominated him the whole fight. I was very impressed with his head kick knockout of Honey Jason. And then against Darren Elkins, again, he was dominating the whole fight, really outclassed Elkins on the feet. Elkins couldn't even come close to getting a takedown. And Stevens dominated him, but couldn't finish him. And I thought that was kind of, that's a concern. And if he can't put away guys like Elkins and Payan, I don't think he has any chance to do that to Cub Swanson. And Cub Swanson is way just a, he's an elite striker compared to guys like Elkins and Payan and even Honey Jason. And everyone talks about Jeremy Stevens' power, his knockout power, which, he has shown. But the last guy he knocked out was Marcus Davis, who was really at the end of his career, really old at that point, and that was his last fight in the UFC. And that was in 2011, New Year's Day of 2011. So he really... I'm sorry, that's not the last guy he knocked out. He did knock out Honey Jason, but before that knockout of Honey Jason... his last knockout was of Marcus Davis. He really, against skilled strikers like Donald Cerrone and Yves Edwards, who did knock out Stevens, he doesn't. His striking game isn't that effective. He was also outstruck by Gillard. Really couldn't get anything going in that fight. And I think Cub Swanson is just a better striker, more aggressive striker, and where Stevens, he can dominate guys for the whole fight and never really hurt them. Swanson is always dangerous. He's always going for the finish. I was really impressed with him in his last fight over Dennis Seaver, which was almost a year ago. He was losing that fight in that first round. Seaver looked great. He was able to take him down. He just looked physically bigger and stronger than Swanson. He was outstriking him on the feet. And Swanson, he didn't let that break him at all. He found a way to come back and ended up finishing Seaver with strikes later in the fight. And he one-shot knocked out Charles Oliveira. He had a tough decision win over Dustin Poirier. Finished Ross Pearson, George Roop. He was doing really well against Lamas before getting submitted. I just really think the body of work he's put in at featherweight and this win streak he's on is a lot more impressive and really telling of his more telling of his abilities than what we've seen from Stevens. Cub Swanson also always finds a way to implement that judo game in his fights. He seems to get one of those judo throws every fight. It's really impressive. Another tool he has, and he just fights like he's real hungry and has that fire every single fight. In that Poirier fight, Poirier even said in that third round that Swanson took him down, and Poirier told him in the cage that he was stealing the fight from him. And after that fight, I remember Poirier saying he just didn't want it as badly as Swanson. And Not to say Stevens doesn't have that same determination, but I really think Cub Swanson's going to take this one, and it's just going to be more dangerous throughout the fight. And as the fight goes on, I think he can create more chaos than Stevens. Stevens might have the better just straight boxing game, but again, Swanson uses those angles and really makes stuff happen in those transitions and the scrambles and kind of the gray area. I'm taking Swanson to win a decision here, and I think he really deserves the title shot even before this fight, and I hope he gets it. But Stevens does have the power. He's been on a good win streak, and of course he could win, but I'm taking Swanson by decision. So those are my predictions for UFC Fight Night 44, Swanson versus Stevens. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. Appreciate it. Please like the video, comment, subscribe. Check out my predictions also for UFC Fight Night 43, Tahuna versus Marquardt. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you next time. I'll be back with recap videos for both of these events, and also have my predictions for UFC 175, Machida versus Weidman up soon. See you later, guys. Thanks.